The most terrifying thing for a photographer is to stand in front of the camera. So you can imagine what's happening now, eh? All right, my name is Sadiki. I'm a photographer. I'm also a mentor and a lecturer for here at Wits for the postgraduate students, journalism students. Wits Center of Journalism, for journalism, right? China, Africa. I mean, we just had a very interesting conversation around AI, and the idea of representation also comes in when we talk about photography, particularly in Africa. I happened to photograph the massacre in 2012 when the police opened fire on the striking miners in Marikana, and I happened to capture the last moment of the miners who were there, who were protesting. And a picture that came out from my assignment at the time, it's a picture that is now commonly known as the man in the green blanket. I think the picture symbolizes the time, and it gives us a timeline in our history, particularly in South Africa. And I looked at how far we've come before the Marikana massacre in 1976, when the young photographer Sam Zema was assigned to go and document a protest again in Soweto. He captured a moment as well of Hector Peterson, who was gunned down by the police, by the apartheid regime police at the time. And I think those two images gives us a time frame, and it gives us context in history, as people who are more fortunate to tell stories, give idea of representation, particularly in Africa. I mean, I could mention, other incidences or other occurrences that have happened in other parts of Africa. However, but I was more fascinated by Nzima's ability to capture the image, and an image that evokes emotions, that communicates a very, very important message of our time, and under very difficult circumstances. And it's always like that photographers have to, try and summarize everything in one picture. And if I can ask you if you can remember a story, that was written in 1976 compared to a picture that was taken in 1976. I'm sure you'd agree with me that a photograph comes in mind, right? So I'll try and just go through, because we have our panelist here, because, as a photographer, I knew that I might struggle, so I've brought people who are going to go into details about, the nuances of visual representation in the media space, in our society as well, Three of our panelists. I'll start with Dr. Omar. And I think maybe I'll give him an opportunity to basically give an anecdote of his profile, but I think I'll leave it there so that I don't take much time. But I think let's give our first speaker a chance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege for me to have the opportunity to address this conference and to share some thought with you on why we should take image seriously. This has to do more with my current research on visual framing and also media in general. I am a scientific journalist and also independent researcher and scholar. But before going deep into the subject, I would like to thank the event organizer. I would like a special mention to Bongiwe, Leon, Bongiwe, thank you, Bongiwe, Bongiwe, Leon, Thomas, and all the other members of the staff for their professionalism and for promoting a positive image of Wits or Wits University. So, why we should take image seriously? Okay, there's a problem here. Okay, why we should take image seriously? I firmly believe that we are in a visual space more than yesterday. And some scholars speak of visual turn. So right now, right here, if we look at the gallery of mobile phone, we'll have a lot of image, snakes, rivers, a lot of things. We are surrounded by image. However, qualifying our area as a visual one doesn't imply that images are new. Throughout history, we had image have played a significant role in human civilization, giving rise to what we can call visual culture, which is mainly the relationship between what is visible and the name that we give to what is seen. So what's the difference between yesterday and today? There are two main differences. Speed, the speed with which image circulates around the world, and the second one is the democratization at lightning speed of the ability to produce and diffuse image. While in the past it was really difficult, technically and in terms of time, to produce and diffuse image, even for media, today it's a matter of time. Within a second, you can be a global phenomenon. If you know this man, who knows this man? Bernie Sanders. He was within a second, in a day, a global phenomenon. So the speed with which image circulates now is very, very important. And the second aspect is the democratization. While yesterday, image, how we are shaping the world with image that we can have to shape the world and have the view of the world through image, were mainly controlled by government and media conglomerate. While other panel have talked that there's still control, today everyone here has the ability to produce and diffuse an image. And that is really interesting. Why? Because we can be, each of us, political actors. And that is interesting. Interesting because an artist can use image to promote his work. Terrorists as well can use image as a political tool. So image can be used for ethical and non-ethical purpose, right? So how we use image and how we understand the power of image lead us to the second point why we should take image seriously. Images are unique. They have a special status. And people with strong visual cultures are aware of it. If not, tell me, why, when we want to sometime show shocking picture, we give a stern warning? And why we don't do it when it's language-based text? The power of image is that image can play significant political role. Just take how, for example, we have advertiser specialists, for example, who use image to attract us, and with emotion also, because image can convey important emotion. Here we have, for example, a researcher on migration have made a small remark. When media use individual on their newspaper, it can tend to lead to more compassion and solidarity. And when media use group of individuals, it's the emotion that came from it, it's fear and need of border control. It's the main reason why we have sometime in newspaper, Western newspaper, a lot of image of group migrants. It's for a purpose. It's not for nothing. That is the main reason why we should always interpret image. We need always to ask ourselves what is an image, what is outside an image, and what are the consequences. Let me apply this to my latest research on online visual framing of conflict of mediation in Africa. Okay, I'm going. What we see in the image that I have collected for my research: official government, military, the main actors who create the condition of war and sustain it. What we don't see women, we don't see NGOs, we don't see all the actors and all the mediation practice that is outside of track 2 mediation. And what are the consequences? The consequences is that we are giving more attention to track 1 mediation, which is mainly the practice mediation that is made by state and government, and we left a major part, an important part of mediation practice made by citizens at the ground level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oumarou. I'm going to call our next speaker, Justin Hugh. I hope I'm pronouncing it right.
Oh, it's okay.
He's an architect, photographer, and Justin has documented stories around Africa, along the lines of China and Africa relations. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you. So I think Sali had mentioned some very great points that I was also thinking about talking. So I'll keep mine very short, but then hopefully we'll give you 3 major points to take away. I know it's the end of the day, but I think this is the takeaway from my presentation. One key question I would like to start really quickly is to ask, what does China-Africa look like? What are the images that we think of when we think about China-Africa? This is very important because just a Google search of the word China-Africa gives us these kinds of results. We have very traditional people in uniform wear, construction workers, where you will usually have a Chinese worker together with a local worker. You have a lot of images of politicians, national flags that symbolize the collaboration of 2 countries. So very much state diplomacy or trading or agreements at work. You have infrastructure. You have a lot of conferences like the one we're having here. You have a lot of cultural tropes or identifiers that you can see, like uniform or the use of red that we see a lot in a lot of these images that are used to represent China-Africa relations. For the Western media, it's usually the threat, the rising threat of China in Africa that we'll see a lot. So you'll usually see some Chinese guard or policeman usually standing in front of a state building that implies some kind of risk or danger to Americans or to the West. And this is a very specific language of visual representation that emerges from all of this in the way in which China-Africa is portrayed, with very specific visual cues, representations, and even stereotypes. And even for myself, if I'm taking photographs, there is this immense pressure when capturing topics about China-Africa to incorporate your so-called China-Africa elements. So, things like the Chinese flag, or you'll see some Chinese character and you'll want to include that in your photography, because if you don't, then it's no longer a China-Africa image. I mean, how many of us do we feel this way, right? That this need to incorporate visual tropes and stereotypes. But I think that's dangerous, because what has happened is we've created a culture where basically all the depth and nuances of this topic is now reduced to these simple stereotypes that we find in the form of images. And they're hijacked even more so by algorithms and social media, which is usually comes with the ulterior political motives. So, and think about it, just how many of the images that we see about China, Africa, or in our news is used as clickbait. They're used to draw you into the page, but there's not much of a depth behind that image itself, or even most of the images that you've just seen, right? They're really covering a relationship that on a very shallow basis in the form of representation on a state level, but nothing about what is actually happening behind the scenes. And so then also the other question is, what are the other images that don't look so-called China-Africa that we should then be incorporating in order to diversify the perspectives that we should be bringing out, so that it's not just Chinese state media or the Western media dominating this topic in the form of imagery, which we see so much online. So so hopefully after this presentation, the questions we should be asking is maybe to confuse you more about what China-Africa images should look like, because that's technically should be the purpose, is that we don't have a pre-assumption about what China-Africa aesthetically looks like in the form of an image. And also this is with the exponential rate in which we consume and create images today, as Sali had mentioned before, through social media, images now have become the dominant form of how we communicate, sadly, above text. No one has really much time to read anymore. So we rely on images a lot to get your attention and to communicate what we want to communicate. We use images a lot in our reporting. They're very visual in nature now. Whether we are photographers or not, they have become the dominant way of communication. So even if you have an amazing story to tell and your reporting is really deep, if you use the wrong image, or if you're using an image that's conveying something else, you're actually doing your reporting a very big disservice, because the people reading your report might be looking at your image more than what you're actually trying to say. So I think this is not a topic about photography or photographers. It's really for all of us here who are writing about China, Africa, to really be aware about the images that we use and how we represent this topic, especially for people who are actually well-versed with these topics and not some person just reading off of some image and never having gone to, on the African continent. And so I'll be quick, really. In a way, this is not about technical skill. It's not about how good you are as a photographer, right? We're not talking about composition and skill, which we could talk about later there. But I think what I want to stress is about this awareness about the underlying visual structure that lies behind images, beyond text. So here, what I'll do is just really quickly show you some of the images I've taken of China, Africa from my field work 10 years ago. And I've taken thousands of images, but to be honest, 10 years later, I think what is interesting about the photos that I have found more interesting are the images that you see here today, which do not necessarily imply China, Africa immediately to you, right? Maybe this photograph of a landscape that is under transformation to make way for a new highway suggests other themes that are related to China, Africa, but it's not so obvious, right? The devastation of the landscape to make way for development. Okay, you have a building here, but it's not really strictly Chinese. But then the question is also that I had a lot when I was doing field work was, what is a Chinese project? Is it its style? Is it its design? Just because a contractor who's Chinese is working on it, what is it that makes it Chinese? If the architect is European, and if most of the local workers are coming from that region, and if, say, the materials are being imported from Nigeria or somewhere in Africa, then exactly what is it that makes a project so-called Chinese? And when it comes to visual imagery, I think we're so used to understanding identity and Chinese in a very specific way that it actually fails to capture the other aspects of what makes something Chinese. So here, sorry, there's a glitch in the middle. But here you can see so the top half is actually cropped out. It looks a lot like an American suburb from the 1960s, this modularity, but this is a housing development in Zambia that was built by a Chinese contractor. But the interesting thing about this to me is to me, like most Chinese projects, have this systematization, this modularity, that you see here in this image. that to me is more Chinese than, say, a photograph of a red building or some Chinese element that stylistically might look Chinese, but is actually just a symbol or an image. And there's a lot of issues that come with it. For example, here, because most people cannot afford these houses, you end up having quite an empty town with just a security guard, right? So asking yourself, what do these images tell you? This is a model of a Chinese design plan. But even though it's just a model and not the real thing, I think this tells you a lot as an image about how Chinese people think about urbanization and what kind of cities they're building. So sometimes it's not really the direct thing that you're trying to capture that will tell you the audience what you're trying to say. It might be something indirect that has more of a power on your storytelling. This is an economic zone, but in Zambia, built by the Chinese, the economic zone is something that the Chinese have been using as a urban model to build. So it's not really just building houses or highways. It's also the idea that economic zones can be drivers of urban growth by bringing other forms of industry into the region. But here in this case, at least when I was there, it was still very much empty. And you can tell with the animals that are just grazing in front of this building. And so yeah, these images might not tell you where they exactly are or who built them, but they tell you a lot of other things, which I think should be incorporated. So I don't think we should feel this pressure to always incorporate Chinese so-called stereotypes into our imagery. Sorry, when I was exporting it, the image got cropped out. But here you have this very traditional, okay, this one might look more Chinese in that sense, because anyone who has been to China are very familiar with these types of banners and slogans, and you see them now in Africa. But then to also even the kinds of spaces that Chinese contractors build. So the stadium here, you see the vastness, the scale in which they're building is very different than the kinds of buildings that local contractors are building. So to me, that is what is interesting about what they're building. And then, of course, taking a more documentary approach, spending a lot of time with Chinese entrepreneurs, understanding what they were doing across this continent. This guy who is interested in buying up this plot of land so that he can turn it into a water bottling plant. There was a spring there, so they become metaphors. This image, even though stereotypically may fall into what I was criticizing before, I think still has some merit because it's interesting. This local security guard is wearing a Chinese uniform that looks like a second-handed uniform that comes imported directly from China, right? So it really tells you many things besides the collision of culture or identity, which is that a lot of the local goods that come into Africa come from China. And so there's a material culture and visual culture that you find through the goods that are brought in, and then how that is formed. Again, but the kind of homogeneity of space that you can find, like this very corporate office interiors that's going up in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. But looking at it, you might not tell it's in Tanzania. It could be anywhere. But it's just this kind of place that you see emerging in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere, this homogeneity of space where you could feel like you're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Your Starbucks chain, your airport interiors. So what does that mean when globalization is playing a bigger role in how our cities are being built today? And what does that mean for the people who are using these spaces? So we shouldn't just look at what they're building, we should understand how that's affecting the people who actually are there. I'm gonna go through here quite quickly. I spent a lot of time in mining towns as well. Here is a chapel in front of a coal dump in the Zambian copper belt. So I was very much interested in the relationship between resource extraction and urbanization, and just the presence of mining and resource extraction on the lives of those who live there. Even though not directly China, Africa, I think there's a lot of relevance to that topic. And even images like this, I think in the last session when they talked about AI, I think this is really the opportunity for artists and photographers to pursue images that are not very identifiable, because this is where we can control the narrative that AI cannot control. I think if AI saw this image, it wouldn't be able to understand truly what we're trying to say. And it's in the nuance and the complexity of these images that are not so straightforward. There's no Chinese flags, there's no Africans, there's no Chinese people in the image that allows us to control and bring on other perspectives. This image here also, without being that direct, gives you a lot of interpretation about what might be happening, right? Which allows for a more depth of view without being so literal and direct about it. Here, a view of a slum as viewed from a stadium that was built by the Chinese, perhaps it suggests two kinds of cities that are emerging. One that is very planned and top-down and built by foreigners, and the other city that is built by the locals who are trying to make ends meet. So they're burning trash in the distance. But this type of contrast, I like quite a lot with it because it's not very obvious, but it's also telling you a lot of other things that you might not be aware of. To an informal supermarket that's sitting outside of a formal, like a ShopRite. So this difference between the informal market and the formal market as a result of what the Chinese are building. To then the indirect result of China in Africa, which is that this is the stuff that the Chinese are not building. So I'm not just looking at what they're building, but also as a result of, say, land prices becoming way too unaffordable, you end up having miners ending up building their own houses here. So there's this other side of the picture where the building and the built environment is very artisanal in nature. They end up building everything themselves as a result of all this foreign investment that's happening across the continent. So using oil barrels and turning them into barricades. And this is, someone mentioned about female women in mining. So this was in the copper belt where you find a lot of women having to make ends meet for their families by taking on other jobs, such as opening up a salon. So this kind of imagery, which is not very obvious, but shows you the ways in which locals make their lives work. There's no power here, so they have solar power, right? To the kinds of so these are all miners, but the kinds of jobs that they also have on the side, showing you the impact of privatization on the mines and the loss of livelihood for many of these people, and so on. So just to take it away, I think I talked too much, but I think there's something in an environment where things are happening so fast, especially in journalism, and the rate of information in which we consume today, I think there's a huge value in embracing slowness. Just like I said, these images have been taken 10 years ago, but I still continue to find new things from them. And images that I thought were very interesting at first are really not so interesting to me anymore. And then I continue to find images that are interesting to me now, but not so before. And I think it has to do with this dimension of time that's involved in allowing you to really think and meditate and allow you to think about these images over time. The problem with today is that with images being produced so quickly, we don't really think about what these images are doing to us. And so just some really quick takeaways. I think as our photographer or an artist, it helps to pursue the unfamiliar and unconventional formats, especially now that images are pretty much done by AI. And actually, algorithms have such a huge role in shaping our images now that, in a way, everyone's a photographer. And even with AI generating images, I also question, what is the role of a photographer today? What is the role of images today when it's so much dominated by social media, algorithms and generative AI? So there's a value in pursuing something that's very unfamiliar to you, even if it's an ugly photograph. If it tells you maybe over time something else to the narrative, then there's some value behind that. We should embrace complexity and ambiguous themes, so oversimplify narratives. And it's too much so much so that in our imagery that we use, too much of it is overly simplified and does not look beyond the surface. We should also embrace untraditional formats of storytelling. So as Gen AI now takes over so much of our traditional mode of storytelling and reporting, this is an opportunity for us to embrace other forms of storytelling. In a way, it's like the time when the camera was invented and it disrupted painters, because painters would used to paint realistically. And so if a camera could do what a painter did, there was no need for painters to paint realistically anymore. And that ushered in a lot of abstract art, Picasso, finding other ways to see something in a different way that the camera could not see. So I wonder now, with the emergence of AI, if this is also an opportunity for photographers and reporters to really find other ways of storytelling that might actually be more powerful than what AI can do. And so what are those forms of storytelling? And maybe that could be the next topic for next year. And also to avoid particular aesthetics. We have this especially on Instagram, this desire to make everything look good or beautiful, or there's an aesthetic vibe behind that. But this is so much incorporated into algorithms and the way social media feeds us information that really we should really look beyond aesthetics and really think about the semiotics of what the image is doing. And we need more unique perspectives, not the same. This part, which I will end with, is really maybe not so much apt for a journalist conference, but I think it's still important, is that the imagination, what you don't see, is just as important as what you see. And storytelling that can facilitate the imagination to go beyond what is being reported is a very important tool for at least artists like me, where we can use fables and metaphors, employing experimental tactics to tell our story. Especially, I think in today's world, and this might be a slippery slope, fictional aspects of storytelling can actually tell the truth better than an image that's supposed to be true, but might actually be deceiving you at the same time. I could go on forever about this, but I won't. But I'll end with the fact that the photography gives us the illusion that what it's showing you is true. And that is one of the biggest illusions that we face today. And I guess thankfully, generative AI is disrupting that for all of us once and for all. So now is really the time for us to really look beyond the image as the purveyor of truth and to resort to our own unique perspectives and storytelling to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I think what we take away from Justin's presentation, as he mentions that, in a sense of within the China-Africa relations, that the images are formed in the service of political convenience. And that's why, for me, the subject matter would be more assignment-based. So it would be very difficult for someone who's not a photographer to want to tell a story or capture an image that would have a sense that combines the two. And I think that's why I thought it takes journalists to write about these things equally, to try and illustrate and give us a visual perspective. But I will also introduce the lady in sitting on my left. Bongiwe Mchunu is a photographer. She's also a picture editor. One of the weekly newspapers, Sunday World. However, we'll move to questions. I think Bongiwe will delve more into the aspects of, photojournalism and representation within the media space, particularly as we move, within the digital era. I think any questions that will be based on journalists or photographers, trying to tell the stories that combines the two, can also be referred to her. So I'll open up for Q&A. So if there's any questions, I'm sure the guys are glad to answer your questions.
As somebody who's been in the field of journalism, photojournalism specifically, for almost 10 years, and we have seen a lot of retrenchments in the publication in South Africa. Do you see or value? Where do you see photojournalism going? Because I think also we are at a position where most editors send writers who do not have photography experience. So, how do you view, or where do you see photojournalism going? Thank you.
And that's a very important question because it's on our minds a lot, especially as photojournalists. We've been doing this for over 20 years, and we see the change. It's there. I think it's up to us, as with me as a as much as I'm a photojournalist, I'm also a documentarist. You know, when I'm in the field, as Bongiwe was working for a newspaper, when I'm assigned somewhere, I would make sure that I come back with a story, a documentary, not just Bongiwe going out there as a photographer for a newspaper. I think that's where the younger generation of photojournalists should go, because it's there. As an editor now, it's you know, it's worrying me. We have young journalists who are sent out on the field with, you know, these young people, they have the iPhones, and it's this mentality now that these iPhones take these nice photos, so we don't need a lot of stuff. We don't need a photo department, and some of the newspapers don't have photo departments anymore. Find one guy in the photographic department. So what I would say is, as a photographer, as a photojournalist, you must take your life into your own hands, take your work into your own. Go out there, do your documentary, sell your work, do something. Even, you know, if you go out, you do sell to the newspaper, because the newspapers are still, you know, are still dominating, especially here in South Africa. The newspapers are still there, you know. So my advice would be to go out, document, shoot, and sell your stuff, because it's really not, it's not looking good. I won't lie.
Can I add to that?
Yes, sure.
So I'm not a photojournalist, so I'm not sure if I can answer that, but I think it doesn't matter how you take it. There's no one way to take a photograph. And I think the notion that you need experience or awards or accolades is really not necessary, especially in today's world where everyone literally is a photographer. If you have an iPhone, you can take photos. The danger is not so much that you can or cannot take photos. It's more that we are all taking photos in the same way. And social media and algorithms, they're actually training us how to take photos. Because every time you consume an image, you think that's what a good image is supposed to be. So the danger is that we're all thinking like robots, and we all think that there should be one way of taking a photo. So I would say take photos and just go out there and find your story, but more importantly, find the way you see the world and ask how that is then reflected in your own photography. I tend to like ugly photos, and I mean, it's just because there's just too many nice photos now. Anyone can do that. AI can do that for you. So why do we need to have skills anymore? Like the real skill set is finding your own voice and letting that show. If you can generate work that is clearly coming from yourself and not from someone else, I think that would be a far better and more interesting work than something that looks good on the magazine but looks like any other good work.
Good afternoon to our panelists. In the context of Africa and China, and in general, what constitutes what are the elements of a good photograph?
Bongiwe, do you wanna answer that? What constitutes? Oh, Justin, you can go ahead. It's fine.
I talk too much. You should go.
Delved into that. You delved.
Well, I mean, I think like what I was saying before, I think there's just too many images of the same thing about China, Africa. We literally, I was thinking about going on Midjourney during the AI talk and just prompting it, say, make an image about China and Africa. It would have so much resource of the same thing that it could generate very accurate photos about China, Africa. And the danger is that we don't know it's fake because there's just too much of the same thing. So in my opinion, then this is just me, a good China, Africa photo tells you something that we haven't seen before about China, Africa. And of course, there's technical things that we can talk about. Sequencing, I think we focus too much on the single image. 10 images that work together in a sequence is far more powerful than one single image. This was also something we discussed during the competition as well, but when making a decision. But yeah, we don't fixate so much on the technicality part of it, focus on your voice and what you find, and then find out, once you have that, find out what technique or methodology will best express your viewpoint. So sometimes a picture-perfect photo might actually be harming your narrative because it's like the aesthetic is telling you to do this because you think that's what makes it good, when your narrative is telling you something else.
Justin, I think some of the questions in terms of the criteria and in reference to your question as well, during the walkabout on the other side, on the other side, I was not sure whether I needed to say that there was something. On the other side, the judges will also get an opportunity to take you through of the process, how they come about choosing the image.
Yeah.
My good
Because I also wanted to say something from your question, but I think the answer on the other
If
side.
I can say just short answer, because I'm really short every time. I don't want to go really short. It's a photo that respects law and ethics, whatever the subject. Thank you.
And that tells the story as you. This is one of the criteria that we used. But as I said, some of the questions will come out after we've announced the winner, and you see, how we used the criteria, we categorized the pictures. Can we answer that after?
So my question will go along the lines, the question that's been asked before, in the context of, as you say, Justin, and where now people don't consume, they don't read anymore. People become so lazy, they just want to watch, they just want to see an image and the title of the article and to get a full story of that. In that context, how do you come to choose a picture? How do you avoid the stereotype of the China-Africa picture that we know before? To choose a picture that tells a different story of China and Africa, but at the same time meeting the need of, I'd say, from the Chinese perspective, to be able to say, when anybody see that pictures, he is able to say, this is my presence of China in Africa. I was thinking of one of the pictures you took of inside the building, a picture that can say anything. It can be anywhere, anywhere, as you said, in the same time. Yes, it breaks the stereotype, but at the same time, if you stand from a Chinese political perspective, you're like, it's not really fitting my purpose when I want people to see me in Africa. So how, as a journalist, when journalists are covering China in Africa, how do they do to leave that part of, in same time, meeting the laziness of the readers? At the same time, also fitting the need of those who are involved, the China in Africa, when they tell the stories.
Yeah, the struggle. So I'm not a photojournalist, so I don't have this obligation, which is But as a metaphor, it's very similar to people who use Instagram. I'm not sure if anyone is really into that, but people who are really into the followers and the like counts and the engagement. If you're really into photography, you feel tremendous pressure, even if you don't admit it, to uploading images that you know will be more favorable to the algorithm and to the consumers who are watching your feed. And I felt that way, and so I made it very clear to myself that I should not care about it at all and just pursue that. Because also in the end, you realize it's a really unproductive game. If the algorithm, if you just pay money and things like that, you'll get far more views anyways. But it was that realization in the beginning that made me realize, okay, you know what, this is a useless challenge. This is not worth doing, and it's better to just pursue my own images, no matter how ugly they are. I can understand that office image is very boring, right? But if you think about and this is maybe because I'm coming from the US, and if you live in an African country, this is not new to you. But I think for a lot of Americans who have never set foot on Africa continent before, they would have no idea that this kind of space is also being built. They're used to seeing slums and your typical poverty porn, that showing an image like a boring office space is actually doing a lot for the American viewer. And then to have a title saying this is in Tanzania or somewhere else, that I think already does the trick. I think it's more that if we are always trying to pursue images that we think people want to see, in the end, there's thousands of other people doing the same thing. How unique is your story really? And I think the best images defy your assumption about something. So I think it's usually like you don't want to look at an image and be like, wow, and then realize, well, okay, it was eye candy, but there's not much beyond that. I would rather see an image that's kind of like makes you question why you think it's good, and then later keeps giving you different interpretations and depth behind that image. I think that to me is what's a good image. I know it is completely in opposite of the speed in which we consume images today now, but that's why I think there's a value in pursuing slowness, in embracing the not eye candy photo, because I think they tell us something that the algorithm is not telling us.
But also, can I also answer that also doesn't, it also applies to news photography, not only to how you, when you go out there, Leon can tell you will be going to a protest, it will be like 10 photographers from different media houses. How do you come back to your photo editor, yes, with a different picture of that protest? The protest is not about burning tires only, you know, as even with the Marikana massacre. Look at the picture of Leon, you know, as much as he's got the other pictures, he managed to capture the gory pictures of the shootings of which other people, but he managed to get one picture that invoked something in people, you know, the picture that stood out from all of that. So how do you as a photographer go around that situation of me, Bongiwe? Some other times I'll find myself being the only woman there, or it will be two women and you, Leon, and then 12 guys pushing you around, and you thinking, you know, how do I, you know, clap Leon with this, you know, clap all these guys in this situation? You take yourself out and you go to a corner there in that protest, you go and you find your subjects there, you know. Even with this Africa-China projects, I think with some of the pictures that we judged, this is what we saw. Some of the people in situations where they could have come with just basic, they came up with something that was really striking, you know.
Can I add to that? I'm sorry. Because you're speaking of protests. So just another analogy, and I'm not sure if this answers your question. So I was living in Hong Kong during the whole protest period movement from 2014 to 2023. And very quickly you realize in the protest, you would have like 30 photographers surrounding a protester, and you start to question if we're all looking at the same thing. And then all of a sudden, the only image you see coming out of Hong Kong is the protest the whole time. And here's another analogy. So then I think I have a feeling that, you know, you can look at a social issue not just from what's happening on the ground. I know you have an obligation to be there to document what's happening, and I don't have that obligation, but I think it's helpful to also look at these issues that are related to the protest, but are not necessarily you being on the protest site, right? What are the issues that drive the protest, and so on. So there are many, like you say, many ways to look at a topic in your own way, regardless of whether you're on site or not. Another question, another analogy is, you know, I don't know how many people here have been to Hong Kong before, but for those who haven't, you might think Hong Kong is this place with no land to build on, and that's why there's so many skyscrapers and buildings. It's literally the densest city on earth. That's the impression you get. But the reality is 70% of Hong Kong's land is rural countryside park. It's not buildings. It's not filled with towers. So I found this gap between the way Hong Kong was represented and the reality of Hong Kong super fascinating. Why were we only representing Hong Kong as this urban jungle when in reality it was like rural farmland and mountains and country park? So I think there's a huge problem with representation right now. And the algorithm just makes it worse. It only shows us what we want to see. And so I think we need to be very mindful for all of us who are taking photos, which is all of us, and what we show, to make sure that we're not just perpetuating a representation that is overrepresented, and that we're also finding other ways of representing an issue. So that's why I started taking photos of empty country land up in Hong Kong, because I just thought buildings were, just way overrepresented in Hong Kong, and it only constituted less than 20% of Hong Kong's land.
Okay.
My short answer to your question will be to say that to take a photo for a newspaper is a framing process, and also to write the paper is a framing. So the framing is like a letter, and at the top there is an individual who has the last decision to take. Is about framing. And when you say framing, is to choose something and leave another thing. Thank you.
In closing, I think the Africa-China project opens up to that new way of looking at things in terms of relations, because taking a photograph doesn't exist in isolation. You have to document people's lives. That's why I think it would be very difficult to break the stereotypes that we see, because in the context of Africa as known to be the receiver of aid and China being the ones that gives, I think that narration will change when we start seeing the idea of integration in governments as well as in communities, So it's going to take a while. I mean, I've seen Chinese people in South Africa for the longest time, but I've never seen a Chinese person staying in my community. So for me to tell a different story that's not stereotypical, but very difficult, and to sum that up into one photograph would be even more difficult. That's why I pity the judges, how difficult the process for them to be able to select the images that they've selected was as good as trying to pull a rabbit out of a hat, because that's why I was saying it's more assignment based. You need to go out looking for it. And you need to be a professional in that space as a journalist, as a photographer, as a social media specialist, as a researcher, as a writer. You need to go out there with an intention to tell that story. But it's not like it's gonna just fall on your lap and that's it. That's why, Justin's presentation and the images, you could think they are along the lines that's how we would think the Africa-China relations would be like, But what more can you really, in one frame, sum it up in a different way than what we have seen, as in media and publications. So, yeah, I thought I can pitch in there. Any other further questions or inputs,
Yeah, okay, mine is not a question, but there's an incident to do with Africa-China images that happened in Malawi. I come from Malawi, which I would like to share with here. For some time, there have been issues of Chinese employers, especially in construction sites, abusing African laborers. Now, that has been difficult to be told through images. Then it happened this other time that there was this seasoned journalist. He was passing by a construction site and he captured an image of a Chinese employer chasing a Malawian laborer, and this Chinese employer had a whip in his hand. That image went viral and it became a symbol of Chinese abuse of Malawian laborers, so to say, for quite some time. But it later transpired that That happened because this Malawian laborer was caught stealing some construction materials there. But that was a bit too late. It was after now the picture had gone all over to say, yeah, you see, we've been talking about these things. The Chinese are really abusing Malawian laborers, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our session. If there are no any questions, thank you. Thank you very much.